Hello and welcome back once again to CBR MTG. My name is Angus McKay and I'm flying solo today talking about my love. This is my baby, the deck that I've been working on for quite some time, and if you know me well, you'll know that this deck is held very close to my heart. This is Highlander, Reanimator, and we're going to do a deck tech on it because that's what we're doing nowadays, trying something new, trying something different. So let me explain this deck to you. But first, let me go through why I chose it. So about 5 years ago or so, I was brand new to Magic. I didn't know what to play. I was like looking around for decks because I decided that I wanted to play in to buy in. Everyone was playing Highlander, and I was like, okay, I'll build a Highlander deck. And it turned out that the Timmy inside of me really wanted to put giant creatures into play. And turns out doing it for 1 or 2 mana was basically how I wanted to do it. So I've been playing with this deck for quite some time, and I've been fiddling with it. And this is definitely not... this is my best version of the deck, but there's a lot of different ways to brew it. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But first, let's go through my version of the deck. So this is Highlander Reanimator. Or Reanimator Oath, if you're feeling so inclined to call it that way. The reason that we call it Highlander Reanimator Oath is because in this deck, one of the points that we're using is Oath of Druids. Now, Oath of Druids says at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player may choose a target player who controls more creatures than he or she does, and then the opponent. Now, if that happens, the trigger goes on the stack that says the first player may reveal cards from the top of his or her library until he or she reveals a creature card. If he or she does, that player puts that card onto the battlefield and all other cards revealed this way into the graveyard. So basically, for a 1 in green enchantment, you can flip cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card, but your opponent has to have more creatures than you, and if you do so, you can put it onto the battlefield for free. And this all happens in your upkeep, so it's essentially the most powerful reanimation spell that you could possibly have, because it doesn't even use the graveyard. It just puts it straight into play. So I'm using, this is a Grixis, nearly 100% Grixis, but a very, very, very light splash for Oath of Druids. So the only green spells that are played in this whole deck is Oath of Druids, and then in the sideboard I have Abrupt Decay and Nature's Claim, but we'll go through the sideboard in a second. All the cards in the deck can be put into a few categories. You have the cantrips, you have the lands, you have the reanimation spells, the reanimation targets, and basically the rest is just digging and protection. So you're digging for the spells that you need, and this deck digs very, very well. In the digging aspect, or the filtering, you have some easy ones, so Careful Study and Faithless Looting to draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. Frantic Search, which is banned in Everywhere But Vintage, where you're allowed to draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards, and then untap 3 lands, which is basically free. You have Dak Faden, which is basically just used for that uptick, where you draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. Charter Course, where you can draw 2 cards, then discard a card. And then you have a couple of little bits and bobs that sort of help that, but also to do other things as well. So you have Is It Charm, where one of the things is Loot 2, and Collective Brutality, where escalating actually puts stuff into the graveyard. So the things that we're going to put into the graveyard are Elish Norn, Emrakul, the Aeon's Torn, Ashen Rider, Gristlebrand, Iona, Jin Gataxias, and Kozilek the Great Distortion. And then also, if you're feeling pretty fancy, you can put Dragon's Breath into the graveyard as well. So Dragon's Breath works pretty well because if you mill it with Oath, you get to put the creature onto battlefield with haste and then go from there. Dragon Breath Read, for anyone who doesn't know, when it's enchanted creature has a haste and fire breathing for 1 and a red. But whenever a creature with converted mana cost 6 or greater enters the battlefield, you may have Dragon's Breath go from the graveyard to the battlefield attached to that creature. So essentially you mill it with Oath of Druids and then you put it onto the battlefield. But you can also mill it with the cards that we mentioned previously. Now, Oath of Druids and Dragon's Breath kind of give you a deck building restriction in that you can't play any creatures that aren't fatties, because if you Oath of Druids and you flip into a Snapcaster Mage, you're not going to feel very good. So if you decide to go outside of the Oath package, you definitely can, but it'll open you up to playing Jace Venge Prodigy, which is very good, and Snapcaster Mage, which is also very good, but we're not going down that route. We're doing 100% hits on Oath of Druids, because setting up Oath of Druids can kind of make it a little bit hard for you, you know. So in regards to the reanimation package, we have Animate Dead, Dance of the Dead, Exhume, Death, and Reanimate, and then Stitch Together as well. So kind of a couple of cards that you probably know, a couple of cards that you don't. But basically, these are the cheapest versions of the same ability. So Death is just the more expensive version of Reanimate that only targets creatures in your graveyard. And Stitch Together works well if you have Threshold. Now, main board, very good, but it's an easy side out because people are going to attack your graveyard mercilessly. So getting to Threshold will be a little bit harder post board. Now, if your graveyard is locked down, then you can easily just play Show and Tell and Oath of Druids. So those do not use the graveyard, and you can just put them straight into the battlefield fairly easily. Now, it's a pretty simple deck, right? There's not a whole lot that goes on with this, but if you can't find the creatures, you can use the cantrips or the filtering to help dig through and find the pieces that you need. In regards to tutors, we only have two, is that Vampiric Tutor and Gamble. So Gamble doesn't cost any points, but Vampiric Tutor is 3 points. I've kind of constructed the deck in a way that your ideal turn is turn 2. So you do Vampiric Tutor, or Entomb, or Faithless Looting, or whatever, and you put something in the graveyard turn 1, and then turn 2, use Animate Dead, Dance of the Dead, Exhume, Death, those sorts of things. So basically, you only need to run a very small amount of lands to make that work, and it works pretty well. So in regards to cantrips, we have the classic Highlander playset of Brainstorm, Ponder, Preordain, absolute staple. Cataxian Probe, because it's free, doesn't cost you anything, draws you a card. Along the more expensive side, we have Thirst for Knowledge, where you draw 3 cards, then discard 2 cards unless you discard an artifact card. So we don't have any artifacts in our deck, so we'll always be discarding 2 cards, but at instant speed, we can kind of justify it a little bit. Search for Escanter lends itself to the sort of slow variant. This is a little bit slower than regular ones. I've played decks in the past, and we'll talk about other decks that you can play, other variants of the same deck that you can play. But this deck specifically wants Search for Escanter, because if you can't do the turn 2, you can turn 2, play Search for Escanter, and then every other turn you can reveal, you can look at a creature, put the creature in the bin, and then draw a reanimation spell, which is ideal, obviously, but not impossible at all. And then the flipped version, Escanter, the Sunken Ruin, allows you to look for that reanimation spell. So it has a lot of reach. So you're going for the turn 2, but eventually you can kind of get your way down to turn 4, turn 5, turn 8, turn 10, that sort of thing. In regards to the mana base, we have 7 dual lands. So Badlands, Bayou, Steam Vents, Underground Sea, Watery Grave, Volcanic Island. Then we have 2 basic lands in Island and Swamp, just to protect yourself a little bit for Blood Moon. We've got 2 rainbow lands with Mana Confluence and Forbidden Orchard. Forbidden Orchard being particularly good against when you have Oath of Druids on the battlefield. And then we're playing all the shocks, the fetches that we possibly can. So Bloodstained Mire, Flooded Strand, Marsh Flats, Polluted Delta, Scalding Tarn, Verdant Catacombs as well. We have an Urborg to kind of push everything together, allows us to hit our black mana on time, which is very important. And then after that, we have our protection. So obviously this deck is a halfway between a control deck and the fast combo, but it gives you the best free or cheap counterspells that you can possibly have. So in the counterspells area, we have Daze, Force of Will, Misdirection, Is It Charm, as we mentioned before, Mental Misstep, Muddle the Mixture, Spell Pierce, and Swang Song. Now, Muddle the Mixture has a double benefit of transmuting for your 2-drops. Mostly 2-drops in this deck. There's a lot of things that are 2-drops, so you can search for Collective Brutality if you wanted to mill some cards. Sometimes I've even searched for Escanter if I want to go a bit slower. You can also search for Charter Course, or obviously you can search for Exhume, Animate Dead, Dance of the Dead. The creature package that I chose specifically, I've sort of quandered over this for quite some time, and I believe that these are the best 7 fatties that you can have, and I think 7 is probably the ideal number for this version of the deck. If you wanted to go less protection, you can definitely play more creatures. But Elish Norn, good in the meta, an easy side out as well if the creatures that your opponents control aren't big. But Highlander is like even combo decks will play a Mana Dork or 2, so you usually get pretty good value off Elish Norn. Ashen Rider to get rid of any trouble permanents. Grizzlebrand and Iona, one of the best, 2 of the best creatures to reanimate, because you can obviously stop your opponent from playing Magic or draw a bunch of cards. Jin Gataxia's Core Augur has been hugely beneficial in stopping our opponents from having the thing. Honestly, on turn 2, if you put down a Jin Gataxias and your opponent can't answer it, you usually just win the game, because you draw 7 cards every turn, and your opponent has no cards in their hand allowed. Kozilek the Great Distortion has been a new one, and honestly overperformed. One of the best creatures to reanimate, because although you don't get the cast trigger of drawing up to the 7 cards to have the full 7, you have the ability of discard a card with converted mana cost X and then counter target spell with converted mana cost X. Because as we said before, the deck is mostly 1 and 2 drops, you can counter Swords to Plowshares, you can counter Dreadbore and those big sort of removal spells pretty easily. And all you have to do is reanimate it quickly and then bop your opponent. Because it has Menace, it's a 2-turn clock, and if your opponent doesn't have 2 creatures by the time you have Kozilek on the battlefield, it usually just closes out that game pretty quickly. We have a very small amount of hand disruption with Thoughtseize and Collective Brutality. This is just for a little bit of extra protection, but basically they're both... the reason that I've chosen that number and not Inquisition or Duress is that Duress says target opponent, so we can't target ourselves, and also it doesn't take creatures. And Inquisition or Kozilek won't let us take our big fatties out of the battlefield. In a pinch, we can Thoughtseize ourselves, and Collective Brutality always does everything that we want it to do. Deaththrow Charm is very big in the format, as every format that has been allowed to exist in. So Collective Brutality and Izzet Charm actually help us out a little bit with that. Going into sideboards, I have Abrupt Decay, Chaos Warp, Nature's Claim to protect against Trouble Permanents, Blazing Archon and Terracodon and Nezahal as my replacement creatures, so these come in different matchups. We have Duress for a little bit of against control or combo, Energy Flux and Null Rod to protect against artifact-based decks, Firestorm and Pyroclasm to protect against dorks, Shred Memory as our lonely piece of graveyard interaction, and then Stronghold Gambit to protect. If we kind of can bring it in a lot, it's good because it also puts a creature onto the battlefield for free, but obviously it's a Gambit. You have to make sure that your opponent doesn't have any creatures in hand by the time you play it, which is definitely possible. So what do we bring in against what? Well, if you're playing this deck and you have this sideboard, if you're versing control, you can bring in Duress, Nezahal, the Primal Tide, Pyroblast, Red Elemental Blast. These will protect you against your opponent's counterspells. Nezahal is kind of castable by itself. I mean, we only have 19 lands total, one that doesn't actually tap for mana, being the Bazaar of Baghdad. So having Nezahal just being able to hardcast it, definitely a reasonable option. Against creature-based strategies, I usually bring in the Blazing Archon, if I can, to stop our opponents from attacking, and then Firestorm and Pyroclasm. Just a very light touch to bring in. If you're feeling very inclined, you can bring in Duress as well to replace for the Thoughtseize, for the life loss that you'd be protecting yourself, but usually creature-based decks we're okay against. Against other heavy combo, I usually just bring in Stronghold Gambit and Shred Memory. A lot of good combo decks in the format play in the graveyard, so you can take out some of your worst counterspells and bring in some graveyard hate. For shops decks or artifact-based combo, you can just use Energy Flux and Null Rod. That's usually totally fine. Your mashup is pretty good against those. You can usually just go faster. But if you're feeling so inclined, you can bring Chaos Warp as well. Chaos Warp will also come in against Dark Depths style decks because your matchup is fairly even against Gardening Australia and Backyard Blitz. So you want to be bringing in Chaos Warp, Duress if you feel so inclined, and Shred Memory as well to protect against Life from the Loam shenanigans. So let's talk about some of the different variants of decks that you can play. I've seen a couple of decks play a little bit different. So basically, you can play the heavy control version where you have Iona and Gristlebrand and a couple of reanimation spells, and then it's just Grixis control. Totally reasonable option. But it's not really a Reanimator, it's just a reanimation win con. So if you're so inclined, you can absolutely do it that way. All you'd have to do is cut out your bad tutors. So you can cut out Vampiric Tutor and Gamble, and you can cut out some of the digging stuff and some of the reanimation spells and some of the creatures, and you just replace it with Fatal Pushes and Lightning Bolts and Kess and that sort of thing. And then even out the mana base a little bit, because if you're playing control, you probably want more than 19 lands. And you could probably ditch the Bazaar Baghdad as well. If you didn't want to play Oath and you wanted to play the Worldgorger Dragon combo, so Worldgorger Dragon says you animate it with Animate Dead or Necromancy or Dance of the Dead. And it says when it enters the battlefield, exile all permanents. And then when it leaves the battlefield, return all permanents. That interacts well with Animate Dead because Animate Dead detaches, and then Well-Gorged Dragon goes back to the graveyard, and then everything comes back, and then Animate Dead reanimates Well-Gorged Dragon, and then you're tapping your lands in that process, so you're generating infinite mana. So if you wanted to, you could take out Emrakul the Eon's Torn, Oath of Druids, and possibly even Show and Tell, and then you just bring in Necromancy, Una, Queen of the Fae, and Well-Gorged Dragon. So it's a pretty easy in-out, but when you play that version, you can also play Snapcaster Mage and Jace Vance Prodigy because you don't have to worry about Oath of Druids wheeling into Jace or Snapcaster Mage. Both cards very, very good in this deck, however, doesn't work with Oath, unfortunately. This is the Grixis version. You can also play Jund and you can play Esper, so it depends on how you want to play it and your play style, but the basic structure is in black and blue, so any other cards that you decide to play around that is up to you. You can play a sort of, I've seen a Solar Flare variant with Sun Titan and Gifts Ungiven and Unburial Rites, so that's more of a control package again, but definitely another way to play it. Also, if you want, you can just play heavy combo, not worry about any of the protection. You take out all the protection spells, and then you bring in more reanimation, more hand disruption, and more creatures. So you can bring in Necromancy and you can bring in Sneak Attack, and that format works really well, but you still have to have the blue. Even if you're less inclined, you want to play like red-black, you could, theoretically, but the version, this version, because it's Highlander, you need this sort of cantrips to sort of help you along. So still play blue for Charter Course and Careful Study and Dak Vaden. There's a black variant as well, it's just mono black, but that's sort of like, it would be a prison-style deck with Contamination and Ophiomancer, and you'd be able to play Grave Titan, Massacre Worm, that sort of thing. That's sort of a thing that you could play in Treat the Dead, which is a new card from the Commander set. How do you beat this deck? The correct answer is Graveyard Hate. If you want to beat this deck, it's very, very possible. Game 1, have counterspells is usually a good plan. This deck kind of is very... battles very hard against control, so if you can counter the crucial spells and not have them countered back, then that's a good way to do it. And then in the sideboard, you would just bring in your Tormoid Script, your Grafdigger's Cage, your Rest in Peace, your Leyline of the Void, that sort of cards, and it makes it very hard for Reanimator decks to go off. It is possible to go off without it, but I would suggest if you weren't sure and you only had a few slots, 100% bring in Grafdigger's Cage because it actually stops Oath of Druids as well. And you could also protect yourself from sort of Green Sun Zenith and Collected Company and those sorts of things from other decks. So it gives you a little bit of flexibility. Flexibility in Highlander is very, very important. Obviously, I was talking about some cards before, Collective Brutality and Is It Charm. These two cards do multiple things and they all do the thing that I want to have done in my deck. So modal spells, escalate spells, highly recommend for decks like decks in Highlander. And if you can set it up, and I highly recommend you try it, if the game goes long, for bonus points, please tweet at me, @DudeThisGuy, or message me in the Discord if you manage to get Elesh Norn onto the battlefield and cast Life, which is the second half of Life Death. Turn all your creatures into 3/3s and bop your opponent. My name has been Angus McKay. This has been CBR MTG's Highlander Deck Techs, and we'll talk to you next time.